Case 1. Shanna Liz Golyar. For nearly 4 years, Nancy Rainey received text messages and emails from her daughter. The messages explained why Carrie had missed the family wedding, why she had skipped Thanksgiving, why she had moved to Kansas without warning. Some were apologetic, some were cold. All of them carried the rhythms and inside references of a woman Nancy had raised. The daughter was Carrie Leah Farver, a 37-year-old computer programmer who had vanished from Omaha, Nebraska, on November 13, 2012. The woman sending the messages was not Carrie. It was Shanna Golyar, the person who had killed her, orchestrating a digital afterlife so elaborate that investigators would ultimately document more than 40,000 forged messages sent across phones, email accounts, and social media over the span of 4 years. Shanna Elizabeth Golyar was born in 1979 in Michigan. She left school after earning a high school diploma, worked in cleaning services and other minimum wage jobs, and settled in the Omaha area as a divorced mother of 2. Acquaintances described her as quiet and intense rather than social. She had no prior violent record. In 2012, she had begun casually dating a mechanic named Dave Krupa, who had been clear that he was not interested in commitment. What Krupa did not know was that his casualness was being interpreted by Golyar as exclusivity, and that her financial pressure and personal instability had fused with an obsessive fixation on being the only woman in his life. Carrie Leah Farver was a 37-year-old single mother and computer programmer. She held a college degree in information technology and was respected in her field. She had a teenage son and a close relationship with her mother, Nancy Rainey. She had recently been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but was managing the condition competently. In the fall of 2012, she had begun seeing Dave Krupa. The relationship was new and informal. The obsession trained on her from across the apartment complex was invisible from where Farver stood, though it had been accumulating for weeks. The morning of November 13, 2012, Farver left Krupa's apartment to drive to work. She never arrived. Investigators would later conclude, based on circumstantial evidence, that Golyar intercepted her within hours, killed her by means believed to be stabbing, and disposed of the body so thoroughly that it has never been recovered. Farver's phone and car were taken. Within the same day, text messages began flowing to Krupa and to Nancy Rainey. The texts claimed that Carrie had taken a job in Kansas, that she needed distance, that she wanted to be left alone. The messages kept coming for weeks, then months, then years. They came from Carrie's actual phone number. They referenced Carrie's personal history. They sounded like her. When investigators eventually mapped the digital forensics, they determined that Golyar had used scheduling software, spoofing tools, and obsessive dedication to maintain the illusion that Farver was alive and choosing not to return. The case did not become a murder investigation until 2015. For the first 3 years, local police treated Farver's disappearance as voluntary. Detectives Ryan Avis and Jim Doty reopened the file in 2015 and brought in digital forensic specialist Anthony Cava. IP addresses traced back to Golyar's home and devices. A photograph of Farver's foot, bearing a distinctive tattoo, was recovered from a tablet Golyar owned. Blood matching Farver's DNA was found beneath the fabric of the passenger seat of her abandoned car. During the same period, Golyar burned down her own house and shot herself in the leg, attempting to frame the non-existent missing Farver for the attacks. The self-inflicted framing scheme collapsed under forensic scrutiny. Arrest followed on December 22, 2016. Golyar was charged with first-degree murder. Trial began in August 2017 in Douglas County District Court. Golyar waived her right to a jury, and the case was heard by Judge Timothy Burns. Prosecutor Brenda Beadle mapped the digital web sentence by sentence, walking the court through the 40,000 messages and the physical evidence. Defense attorney James Martin Davis argued that without a body, the prosecution could not prove murder had occurred. Judge Burns rejected the argument. On August 15, 2017, Golyer was found guilty of first-degree murder. In November 2017, Judge Burns sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, consecutive to a sentence of 15 to 20 years for an earlier arson conviction. Nancy Rainey delivered a victim impact statement describing the particular cruelty of receiving fabricated text messages from her dead daughter for nearly half a decade. The Nebraska Supreme Court upheld the conviction in 2019. Netflix released the documentary Lover, Stalker, Killer in 2024. And Leslie Rule's book, A Tangled Web, chronicled the case in detail. Shauna Golyer is 47 years old. She is incarcerated at the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women and will never be eligible for release. Carrie Farver's body has never been recovered. The Carrie Farver Memorial Scholarship, established by her family, continues to honor her work in computer science. The case is now taught in digital forensics programs as a landmark in no-body homicide prosecution, a demonstration that the trail a killer leaves online can be as definitive as any physical evidence left at a scene. Case 2. Ashley MacArthur. Hours before she murdered her best friend, Ashley MacArthur walked through a Pensacola Home Depot and purchased bags of concrete, potting soil, and landscaping supplies. She paid by card. The transaction was captured on the store's surveillance system. A degree in crime scene forensics hung on her wall at home. She had been trained in evidence handling, in the significance of receipts, in the digital traces that buyers leave behind. On September 8, 2017, none of that training stopped her from leaving a paper trail that would convict her of the premeditated murder of Taylor Wright, a 33-year-old private investigator who had placed her entire life savings in Ashley's hands for safekeeping. Ashley Britt MacArthur was born in 1977 in Florida. Her family was prominent in the Pensacola area and owned multiple properties, including a rural farm that would become the scene of the crime. She earned a college degree in crime scene forensics, worked as a crime scene technician, and later opened a small local business. She married Zachary MacArthur. To neighbors and acquaintances, she presented as a well-connected member of the community with close ties to local law enforcement. Behind the presentation, she was deeply in debt and by 2017 was under active investigation for fraud and embezzlement. The investigation had not yet become public knowledge. Taylor Wright was 33 years old, a former police officer who had transitioned into private investigation. She was divorced and had been navigating a contentious separation that required her to liquidate assets and protect her savings. Ashley was her closest friend. The trust between them was such that Taylor handed Ashley a cashier's check for $34,000, asking her to hold the money so that it could not be touched during divorce proceedings. Taylor believed the money was safe. What she did not know was that Ashley had already deposited the check into her own account and spent it. On September 8, 2017, Taylor checked her bank records and discovered the money was gone. She confronted Ashley and demanded an explanation. Ashley proposed that they ride together to her family farm for a horseback ride so they could talk privately. Hours earlier, Ashley had made the Home Depot purchases. At the farm, Ashley shot Taylor once in the back of the head. She buried the body on the property, poured the concrete over the grave, and covered the concrete with potting soil. She took Taylor's phone and sent messages to Taylor's girlfriend, claiming that Taylor needed time alone to clear her head. Taylor's girlfriend reported her missing within days. Escambia County Sheriff's investigators escalated the case immediately given Taylor's law enforcement background. Ashley inserted herself into the search, offering help and sympathy. financial records pulled by investigators revealed the deposit of the $34,000 cashier's check into Ashley's account. Home Depot surveillance showed her purchasing concrete hours before the murder. Cell phone location data placed her at the family farm during the time window when Taylor vanished. Investigators obtained a search warrant, located the grave, and recovered Taylor's body. A bullet in her skull matched the caliber of firearms Ashley had access to. Arrest followed on October 19, 2017. The trial took place in August 2019 at the Escambia County Courthouse before Judge Alan Cobble. Prosecutor Bridget Jensen presented the financial records, the surveillance footage, the cell phone data, and the forensic evidence from the farm. Defense attorney John Gontarek argued that the case was circumstantial and suggested alternative suspects, including drug cartels and random assailants. The jury was unpersuaded. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, on August 30th, 2019, they returned a verdict of guilty on first-degree premeditated murder. Judge Cobble sentenced Ashley MacArthur to mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole. Taylor Wright's family addressed the court. Her mother spoke of the ultimate betrayal, the loss of a daughter at the hands of the woman Taylor had considered family. The sentencing was immediate and final. At 48, Ashley MacArthur occupies a cell at the Lowell Correctional Institution in Florida. Her release date does not exist. Taylor Wright had spent her career investigating the deceptions of others. The woman who deceived her most completely sat across from her at dinner tables, held her hand during the stress of her divorce, and accepted her most valuable possessions for safekeeping. The $34,000 Taylor trusted Ashley to protect was used to buy the concrete that buried her. Case 3. Stephen Grant. For 3 weeks in February and March 2007, a stay-at-home father in Washington Township, Michigan, gave televised interviews pleading for the safe return of his missing wife. He wept on camera. He appealed to her to call home. He spoke of their 2 young children, who he said cried every night for their mother. During every one of those interviews, Tara Grant's torso sat in a plastic storage bin in the garage, where her husband had placed it after dismembering the rest of her body at his father's machine shop. Stephen Grant had strangled his wife during an argument on the night of February 9th, 2007, and his ability to perform grief on local news broadcasts while her remains decomposed behind him became one of the most documented studies in sustained deception in modern Michigan criminal history. Stephen Christopher Grant was born in 1969 in Michigan. He grew up in a working-class family close to his father, who owned a machine shop in Macomb County. He earned a college degree and married Tara Lynn DeStramp in 1999. Over the course of their 9-year marriage, the couple had 2 children, and the financial dynamics of the family inverted. Tara's career as an executive at Washington Group International outpaced Stephen's professional ambitions. He became a stay-at-home father while she traveled heavily for work, often to Puerto Rico for weeks at a time. Acquaintances described Stephen as talkative, eccentric, and heavily involved in his children's daily routines. The domestic portrait he projected concealed a growing resentment over his wife's success, her absences, and what he suspected was an affair with a coworker. Tara Lynn Grant was 34 years old. She held a senior executive position and was the primary earner for her household. She had 2 young children. She had been traveling extensively for work in the months before her death, and her suspicion that the marriage was failing had led her to begin exploring an exit. Those who knew her professionally described her as sharp, competent, and ambitious. The affair she had begun with a coworker had not been disclosed publicly, but Stephen believed it was occurring and had been confronting her about it. On the night of February 9th, 2007, an argument erupted at the Grant home over her travel schedule and the suspected infidelity. Stephen strangled Tara with his hands. What followed was a sequence of calculated decisions. He kept her body in the house with the children present, then transported it to his father's machine shop, where he used industrial tools to dismember her. He returned her torso to the family garage in a plastic storage bin and scattered the other remains in a wooded park. On February 14, 2007, he reported her missing, claiming she had stormed out of the house after a fight and never returned. Macomb County investigators grew suspicious within days. Stephen's televised interviews, in which he veered between weeping and inappropriate smiling, raised alarms. Neighbors reported unusual activity at the home. A search warrant was executed in early March 2007. The torso was recovered from the garage. Stephen fled north before the arrest could be made, driving hundreds of miles into the wilderness of the Upper Peninsula. He was captured on March 4, 2007 at Wilderness State Park, suffering from severe hypothermia after trying to survive in sub-zero temperatures. From his hospital bed, he delivered a 3-hour confession to investigators. Trial began in December 2007 in Macomb County Circuit Court. Prosecutor Eric Smith presented the confession, the forensic evidence from the machine shop, and the timeline of the televised deception. The defense argued that the killing had been a spontaneous act of passion during a heated argument and asked the jury to return a manslaughter verdict. The jury declined. On December 21, 2007, Stephen Grant was convicted of second-degree murder and mutilation of a corpse. In February 2008, the court sentenced him to 50 to 80 years in prison. His earliest possible release date falls in 2057. The Michigan Court of Appeals upheld the conviction on direct appeal. Stephen Grant is 56 years old. He is incarcerated at the Bellamy Creek Correctional Facility in Ionia, Michigan, where he will remain into his second century of age if he lives long enough for parole consideration. The 2 children he shared with Tara grew up without their mother, raised by extended family. The televised interviews in which Stephen pleaded for his wife's return remain available in archived news coverage, a permanent record of a father performing grief, while the evidence of his guilt sat in the garage behind him. Case 4. Stephen McDaniel. On the afternoon of June 30th, 2011, a Macon, Georgia television reporter interviewed a young law school graduate who lived next door to a missing woman. The reporter was gathering reaction from Lauren Gittings's neighbors and friends. Stephen McDaniel answered her questions calmly until she mentioned, almost in passing, that a body had just been discovered in a dumpster near the apartment complex. The color drained from his face. His body went rigid, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the camera. He stammered that he needed to sit down and collapsed onto the steps of the building as the reporter kept filming. The footage became one of the most viewed true crime broadcast moments of the decade. 4 days earlier, McDaniel had killed Lauren Gittings in her apartment with his own hands. Stephen Mark McDaniel was born in September 1985 in Georgia. He attended Mercer University Law School in Macon, graduating in May 2011. His name had never appeared in a law enforcement database before that summer. Classmates and neighbors described him as intensely awkward, isolated, and obsessive. He lived alone in an apartment next door to Gittings, in the same building, with only a wall separating their living spaces. He was unemployed after graduation and had no immediate plans. Behind the quiet exterior, he had developed a fixation on his neighbor that he had been nurturing for months through surveillance, photography, and theft. Lauren Teresa Gittings was 27 years old. She had graduated from Mercer Law School alongside McDaniel. She was preparing to sit for the bar exam and was in the process of packing up her apartment to move out of state for a new job. She was athletic, social, and surrounded by a network of friends and family. To those who knew her, she represented the end of a long educational journey and the beginning of a professional life she had worked hard to earn. She was the kind of neighbor who waved hello, who held doors open, who had no way of knowing that the quiet man across the hall had been watching her through her windows and cataloging her routines. In the early hours of June 26, 2011, McDaniel used a master key he had stolen from the apartment building to enter Lauren's unit. He watched her sleep. When she woke, he attacked her and strangled her. He then dismembered her body in the bathtub using a hacksaw. He placed her torso in a trash bag and disposed of it in a dumpster behind the apartment complex. The other portions of her remains have never been recovered. He returned to his own apartment next door and resumed ordinary life. Friends became alarmed when Lauren did not respond to calls or messages. On June 30th, they requested a welfare check. The torso was discovered in the dumpster the same day. Macon police began interviewing residents, and McDaniel was among them. His televised collapse during the news interview occurred within hours of the body's discovery. Investigators searched his apartment the following day. They recovered the stolen master key, a hacksaw bearing both McDaniel's and Giddings' DNA, and a computer containing videos he had taken through her bedroom window, as well as search histories exploring methods of killing. He was arrested on July 1st, 2011, and charged with murder. Rather than proceed to trial, McDaniel accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. Prosecutor David Cook secured a guilty plea to murder and related charges. The plea spared Lauren's family the ordeal of a capital prosecution and guaranteed a life sentence. Under the terms of the agreement, McDaniel was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 30 years. Stephen McDaniel is 40 years old. He is incarcerated at Hancock State Prison in Sparta, Georgia. His earliest parole eligibility falls in 2041, when he will be 55. Lauren Giddings' remains were never fully recovered, and her family buried only what could be found. Mercer University Law School established scholarships and memorials in her name. The televised moment of McDaniel's collapse, paused and replayed in true crime retrospectives, has outlived his public presence. He has given no public interviews since his conviction. Case 5. Chandler Halderson. While his parents' dismembered remains burned in the fireplace of the family home, Chandler Halderson sat on the couch and played online video games with friends. Chat logs from the evening of July 1st, 2021, show him joking, strategizing, and competing in a multiplayer match as smoke rose from the living room of the house in Windsor, Wisconsin. He had shot his father that afternoon. He had killed his mother hours later. He had spent the evening reducing them both to materials that could be scattered across rural Wisconsin to avoid detection. A week later, he reported them missing, told police they had gone to a cabin for the Independence Day weekend, and produced a trail of fabricated explanations that began unraveling within hours of the first interview. Chandler Halderson was born in 1997 and raised in the Madison, Wisconsin area. He lived with his parents into his early 20s. Outwardly, he had the profile of an ambitious young professional on the rise. He told his family and his girlfriend that he was enrolled at Madison Area Technical College, that he had recently graduated, and that he had accepted an entry-level engineering position with SpaceX. None of those statements were true. He had dropped out of college. He had forged enrollment records, created fake emails from imaginary academic advisors, and produced a counterfeit offer letter from Elon Musk's aerospace company. The lies had grown in scope and scale over several years, and by the summer of 2021, they had become impossible to maintain. Bart Halderson was 50 years old and worked as an accountant. Krista Halderson was 53 and worked in customer service. They were devoted parents who had supported their son through every step of what they believed was his academic and professional journey. In late June 2021, Bart had scheduled a meeting at Madison Area Technical College to verify Chandler's enrollment status, believing a phone call would put to rest his lingering suspicions about the SpaceX job. The meeting was scheduled for early July. Chandler knew that a 10-minute conversation with a college registrar would demolish every lie he had told for years. On July 1st, 2021, Chandler shot his father inside the family home in Windsor. He killed his mother hours later. He then began the process of dismemberment. Portions of both parents were burned in the living room fireplace. The remainder was loaded into his vehicle and scattered across rural locations in Dane County, including a stretch of wooded land along a river. Text messages and Snapchat exchanges from that evening show him maintaining social contact with friends as if nothing had happened. On July 7th, 2021, Chandler reported his parents missing. He told police they had left for a cabin on the 4th of July weekend and had never returned. Detectives noticed inconsistencies immediately. Phone records did not support the cabin story. Forensic investigators recovered bone fragments from ash in the fireplace. Chandler's girlfriend, questioned by investigators, provided access to her Snapchat location sharing data, which placed Chandler at the rural river location where Krista's remains were later found. The SpaceX offer letter and the college fabrications surfaced under scrutiny. He was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, along with hiding a corpse, mutilating a corpse, and providing false information. The trial took place in January 2022 in Dane County, Wisconsin. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence, the cell phone data, the fabricated documents, and the timeline of the lies that had motivated the killings. Defense attorneys challenged the premeditation argument and attempted to portray the shootings as the product of a sudden domestic confrontation. But the physical evidence and the digital record foreclosed the theory. The jury convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on the 2 homicide counts, with additional consecutive time for the corpse-related charges. The sentencing judge described the crime as one of the most calculated parricides in Wisconsin history. Halderson, 28, resides at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Walpen, Wisconsin. No parole review is scheduled in his lifetime. The SpaceX letter remains in the evidence record, an artifact of a fantasy that collapsed at the cost of 2 lives. Bart and Krista Halderson had raised a son who would rather kill them than let them discover he had lied. Case 6. Patrick Frazee. On Thanksgiving Day, 2018, a Colorado cattle rancher asked his 29-year-old fiancée to sit down on the floor of her townhome and close her eyes. He told her he wanted her to guess the scents of different candles he had brought. She cooperated. He placed a blindfold over her eyes. While she sat with her hands empty and her vision obscured, he raised a baseball bat and beat her to death. Patrick Frazee had come to Kelsey Barrett's home in Woodland Park, Colorado, with the method of the killing already designed. The candle game was the weapon that made her defenseless. What followed was a cleanup operation involving his secret mistress, a plastic storage tote, a remote ranch, and fire. Patrick Frazee was born in 1986 in Colorado. He worked as a farrier, shoeing horses across the region, and ran cattle on a family ranch. He was engaged to Kelsey Barrett and was the father of their infant daughter, but the two were living separately. To those who knew him professionally, he was competent, physical, and reserved. What he had hidden from Barrett was a long-running affair with a nurse named Crystal Kenny, who lived in Idaho and made trips to Colorado to see him. Frazee had been manipulating Kenny for months, telling her stories about Barrett's alleged neglect of the couple's child, and had been pressuring her to help him kill the mother of his baby. Kelsey Barrett was 29 years old, a flight instructor, and the mother of the couple's daughter, who was just over a year old on the day of the murder. She had been pulling away from Frazee in the weeks before her death, preparing to secure custody of her child and build a life independent of him. Friends and family described her as warm, funny, and protective of her daughter. She had no public history of concern about Frazee and appeared to be navigating the separation on her own terms. The candle proposal that Thanksgiving afternoon read as a quirky gesture from a man she had once planned to marry. On November 22nd, 2018, Frazee entered Barrett's townhome while their daughter was in the next room. He executed the candle ruse and beat her to death with a baseball bat. He called Crystal Kenny in Idaho and instructed her to drive to Colorado immediately to clean the scene. Kenny spent hours scrubbing blood from the walls and floors of the townhome. Frazee transported Barrett's body to his ranch, placed it in a black plastic storage tote, and burned the tote and its contents. He then resumed ordinary life. Barrett's mother grew concerned when her daughter stopped responding to calls. She requested a welfare check on December 2nd, 2018. Investigators entered the townhome and found blood beneath the floorboards that Kenny had been unable to fully remove. Forensic searches of Frazee's ranch recovered a human tooth fragment at the burn site. The critical breakthrough came when Crystal Kenny agreed to cooperate with the FBI in exchange for a reduced charge. She described the candle game, the cleanup, the drive to the ranch, and the burning of the tote in detail. Frazee was arrested shortly afterward. Trial began in November 2019 at the Teller County District Court. Kenny's testimony anchored the prosecution's case, supported by the physical evidence recovered from the townhome and the ranch. Defense counsel attempted to shift responsibility onto Kenny by arguing she had been the architect of the plan, but the corroborating physical evidence foreclosed the argument. The jury convicted Frazee of first-degree murder, solicitation to commit murder, tampering with a deceased body, and crime of violence counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 156 years consecutive. Crystal Kenny received a 3-year sentence for her role in the cover-up. Patrick Frazee is 39 years old. He is incarcerated at the Arkansas Valley Correctional Facility in Ordway, Colorado. The daughter Barrett fought to raise grows up now in the custody of her grandparents, with a mother she will know only through photographs, and a father she will see, if at all, through prison glass. Case 7. Paul Flores. For 24 years, a retired contractor named Ruben Flores drank his morning coffee on the back deck of his home in Arroyo Grande, California, directly above the burial site of a 19-year-old college freshman named Kristen Smart. The deck was part of an ordinary suburban backyard. The house looked like any other in the quiet neighborhood. Beneath the wooden planks, soil tests would eventually reveal a body-sized anomaly containing biological markers consistent with human remains. The silence held for more than 2 decades, preserved by a father who helped his son conceal a crime, and by a justice system that took nearly a generation to catch up. The murder of Kristen Smart on the night of May 25th, 1996, became one of the longest unresolved disappearances in modern California history, and its resolution came only after a podcaster spent years refusing to let the case die. Paul Ruben Flores was born in 1977 in California. In the spring of 1996, he was a freshman at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Classmates had given him a nickname that captured his reputation on campus, a crude reference to his documented pattern of following women, staring at them in hallways, and behaving in ways that made female students avoid him. He had no criminal record. He lived in the dormitory adjacent to Kristen Smart's. Kristen Denise Smart was 19 years old, also a freshman at Cal Poly. She was 6 feet 1 inch tall, a former high school athlete, and had been at the university less than a full academic year when she vanished. Her family in Stockton described her as outgoing, independent, and excited about the life she was building in San Luis Obispo. On the night of May 24th, 1996, she attended an off-campus Memorial Day weekend party. She became heavily intoxicated. In the early morning hours of May 25th, friends tried to walk her back to her dormitory. Paul Flores inserted himself into the group and volunteered to see her the rest of the way home. The friends led him. It was the last confirmed sighting of Kristen Smart alive. Flores brought Smart to his dormitory room. What happened inside has never been publicly detailed in full, but prosecutors at his eventual trial argued that he attempted to rape her and killed her in the process. Her body was removed from the dormitory before investigators could search his room with a warrant. His father, Ruben Flores, assisted in concealing the remains beneath the deck of his Arroyo Grande home, where they would remain for more than 20 years. The initial investigation stalled. Campus police treated the disappearance as a likely runaway for weeks. Evidence was lost. Witnesses were not properly interviewed. The case went cold. In 2019, investigative journalist Chris Lambert launched the podcast Your Own Backyard, which dedicated itself to the Smart case and generated massive public pressure. In early 2021, ground-penetrating radar and soil analyses conducted beneath Ruben Flores' deck revealed the body-sized anomaly and the presence of human biological markers. Paul Flores was arrested on April 13, 2021, and charged with first-degree murder. His father was charged as an accessory. The trial was moved to Monterey County on a change of venue and took place from July to October 2022. Prosecutors presented the witness accounts from the 1996 party, the forensic findings from the Arroyo Grande excavation, and patterns of Flores' predatory behavior toward other women in the decades after Smart disappeared. The jury convicted Paul Flores of first-degree murder. His father, Ruben, was acquitted of the accessory charge. Paul Flores was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. He remains incarcerated within the California state prison system. The Kristen Smart Campus Safety Act, passed in 2016, had already transformed how California universities handle missing student reports, requiring immediate coordination with local law enforcement rather than internal delays. Paul Flores is 48 years old. Kristen Smart's remains have not been publicly confirmed recovered, though investigators believe they were moved from beneath the Arroyo Grande deck shortly before the 2021 excavation. The 25-year silence between her disappearance and her killer's conviction stands as one of the longest gaps between crime and accountability in a campus disappearance case in American history. Case 8. Zachary Adams. Clint Bobo stood at the kitchen window of his family's rural Tennessee home on the morning of April 13, 2011, and watched a man in camouflage lead his 20-year-old sister, Holly, into the woods behind the property. The man had his arm around her. Holly was carrying her nursing textbooks. Clint assumed the figure in camouflage was her boyfriend, and that the two were going for a walk before she left for her nursing classes. He turned back to his morning. Hours later, when Holly did not answer her phone and her car remained in the driveway, he understood what he had seen. By then, Holly Bobo was gone. The search that followed became the largest missing persons investigation in the history of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, spanning more than 3 years, thousands of volunteers, and rural Decatur County terrain that had swallowed evidence for generations. Zachary Rye Adams was born in 1984 and grew up in Decatur County, Tennessee. He was known locally as a violent and unstable figure with a long record of drug offenses and assaults. He lived in the same rural area as Holly Bobo's family, and though not an acquaintance, existed within the narrow web of people who passed through the county roads and backwoods where the abduction would take place. His criminal history should have placed him under scrutiny from the start. It did not. Holly Lynn Bobo was 20 years old and a nursing student at the University of Tennessee at Martin. She lived with her parents and brother in a rural home in Darden, Tennessee, and commuted to classes several days a week. She was on track to complete her degree within the following year. Friends and family described her as gentle, faith-centered, and devoted to her plan of becoming a pediatric nurse. She had a steady boyfriend, a predictable routine, and a community that knew her by sight. The morning she was abducted, she was beginning her day as she always did. On April 13th, 2011, Adams and at least one accomplice approached the Bobo home. They forced Holly from her property and took her to a remote location in the wooded county. Over the following hours, she was assaulted and ultimately shot in the head. The men concealed her remains in dense wilderness so thoroughly that more than 3 years would pass before any part of her body was recovered. The investigation was massive and slow. Thousands of volunteers searched the woods. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation coordinated with the FBI. Tips and informant reports accumulated over the years. In September 2014, ginseng hunters working in a remote patch of wilderness discovered a human skull, later confirmed to be Holly's. The discovery provided the physical evidence prosecutors needed. Informants came forward with accounts of Adams boasting about the murder and implicating associates. Adams was arrested and charged along with co-defendants. Trial began in September 2017 and was moved to Hardin County on a change of venue due to intense local publicity. Prosecutors presented the witness testimony, the skull evidence, and the accounts of informants who had heard Adams describe the killing. The defense tried to shift blame onto co-defendants and discredit informant testimony. The jury convicted Zachary Adams of first-degree felony murder, especially aggravated kidnapping, and aggravated rape. A last-minute negotiation avoided the death penalty in exchange for a guilty verdict guarantee and a waiver of death phase proceedings. Adams was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 50 years consecutive. At 41, Zachary Adams remains within the Tennessee Department of Correction. The combined terms of life without parole and 50 consecutive years have removed any pathway to release. Holly Bobo's family established memorials and scholarships in her name, and her parents became advocates for rural area missing persons response. Clint Bobo has spoken publicly about the morning he saw his sister led into the woods and did not understand what he was witnessing. The recognition came too late to stop what followed, and he has carried the knowledge for the rest of his adult life. Case 9. Melanie McGuire. In May 2004, fishermen trolling the waters off Virginia Beach hauled up a matching set of Kenneth Cole luggage that had washed out of the Chesapeake Bay. Inside the 3 suitcases were the carefully wrapped remains of a 39-year-old New Jersey computer programmer. The body had been drained of blood, dismembered with surgical precision, and packaged with the care of someone who understood anatomy. The woman who had performed the work was his wife, a fertility clinic nurse named Melanie McGuire, whose professional training had given her the anatomical knowledge necessary to reduce a 6-foot man to portable pieces. The suitcases had been thrown from the Chesapeake Bay Bridge tunnel hundreds of miles from the crime scene, but the currents had returned them, and what she had done to her husband could now be read by forensic specialists as clearly as a textbook diagram. Melanie Lynn McGuire was born in 1972. She worked as a nurse at a fertility clinic in New Jersey and had built her career around reproductive medicine. She was married to William McGuire. The public image of the McGuire family was unremarkable. 2 young sons, a pending home purchase, both parents employed in stable careers. Behind the portrait, Melanie was in the midst of an affair with a doctor at her clinic. She had begun purchasing weapons and researching methods of disposing of a body in the weeks before her husband's death. William Bill McGuire was 39 years old, a computer programmer, and the father of the couple's 2 boys. He had been planning to close on a family home the week he was murdered. He was known to his coworkers and extended family as a steady, dependable man who was eager to move into the new house and continue building his family's life. He had no knowledge of his wife's affair, and the evening of April 28, 2004, arrived for him as an ordinary Wednesday. On that night, in the couple's Woodbridge apartment, Melanie drugged her husband with chloral hydrate. She then shot him twice. She dismembered him in the apartment. She packed his remains into 3 matching Kenneth Cole suitcases and drove south to Virginia. She threw the suitcases from the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. She then drove Bill's car north to Atlantic City and abandoned it in a casino parking lot, staging a disappearance that would suggest he had fled over gambling debts. The currents carried the suitcases back to shore within days. Virginia authorities opened the containers and began the process of identifying the victim. The remains were traced to Bill McGuire within weeks. New Jersey investigators took over the primary case. Forensic analysis became the spine of the prosecution. A polymer expert traced the plastic trash bags inside the suitcases to the exact roll of bags kept in the McGuire home. Sawdust recovered from the body was matched to a home workshop by DNA and material analysis. Toll Plaza cameras captured Melanie's vehicle crossing into Delaware on the drive south. Phone records documented her communications with her lover. Her purchases of the weapons, the drugs, and the suitcases were traced through store records. Trial began in 2007 in Middlesex County, New Jersey. Prosecutors walked the jury through the forensic chain, the financial motive, the affair, and the staged Atlantic City disappearance. Defense attorneys argued that Bill McGuire had been killed by others involved in gambling debts, and that the evidence against Melanie was circumstantial. The jury rejected the argument. Melanie McGuire was convicted of first-degree murder, desecration of human remains, perjury, and additional counts. She was sentenced to life in prison. The New Jersey appellate courts have upheld the conviction on multiple reviews. Melanie McGuire is 53 years old. The Edna Mahan Correctional Facility for Women in Clinton, New Jersey, holds her as a lifer. Her 2 sons were raised by extended family after the murder. She has maintained her innocence in interviews, podcasts, and a documentary, but no court has found her appeals persuasive. The clinical understanding of the human body that had defined her nursing career became the instrument of her husband's disposal and the evidentiary foundation of her conviction. Case 10, Kelly Cochran. On their wedding night, Kelly and Jason Cochran allegedly made a pact. If either of them ever took a lover, the unfaithful spouse would help the other kill the lover. The agreement, reported by acquaintances and later described by Kelly herself during her confession, was framed as a test of commitment, a theatrical gesture of loyalty that most young couples would forget within a year. The Cochrans did not forget. More than a decade into their marriage, on October 14, 2014, the pact was activated. Christopher Regan, an Air Force veteran and iron mine worker who had been having an affair with Kelly, was shot in the back of the head inside the couple's Iron River, Michigan home. What began as a marital fantasy ended with 2 deaths, a dismemberment in the basement, and a confession that emerged only after Kelly turned the weapon of the pact on her own husband. Kelly Marie Cochran was born in 1983. She married Jason Cochran and lived with him in rural Michigan. Both worked in the mining and service industries of the Upper Peninsula. Neighbors and family members later described the marriage as isolating, volatile, and defined by mutual dependence that bordered on codependence. Her name had never appeared in a courtroom before the murders. She worked multiple jobs, including at a local iron mine where she met Christopher Regan. Christopher Regan was 53 years old. He had served in the Air Force and had built a career in mining after his military service. He was divorced, a father, and well-regarded among his co-workers. He had begun an affair with Kelly Cochran in 2014. What Regan did not know was that Kelly had told her husband about the relationship and that the two of them had begun planning to kill him. He believed he was navigating an adult affair with a troubled woman. He was walking into the activation of a decade-old pact. On October 14th, 2014, Kelly invited Regan to the Cochran home in Iron River. She led him to a bedroom. While she was with him, Jason emerged from concealment and shot Regan in the back of the head. The couple moved the body to the basement, where they dismembered it over the course of several hours. They placed the remains in garbage bags and disposed of them in the woods surrounding their property. Regan's car was driven to a park and ride and abandoned, creating the appearance that he had left the area voluntarily. The investigation stalled. Regan was reported missing. The car was recovered. No physical evidence pointed clearly to the Cochrans, and the case drifted for more than a year. In February 2016, Jason Cochran died of what was initially reported as an accidental overdose. The couple had moved to Indiana by then. Suspicion turned on Kelly almost immediately. She was questioned, cracked under pressure, and confessed that she had intentionally given Jason a lethal dose of pills because she blamed him for taking Christopher Regan from her. During the same series of interviews, she confessed to her role in Regan's murder and led investigators to the remote location where his skull was recovered. Trial began in November 2017 in Marquette County, Michigan. Prosecutors presented the confession, the forensic evidence from the skull site, and testimony from neighbors and acquaintances who described the Cochrans' pact and the escalation that followed. Defense attorneys argued that Kelly had been coerced by her husband into the roles she played, but her own statements during the confession undermined the theory. Kelly Cochran was convicted of first-degree murder and mutilation of a corpse. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Indiana prosecutors subsequently secured a guilty plea for Jason Cochran's murder, adding 65 years consecutive to the Michigan sentence. Kelly Cochran is 42 years old. She is incarcerated at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Investigators and Kelly's own brother have publicly alleged that she may have served portions of Christopher Regan's remains at a neighborhood barbecue shortly after his disappearance, though no evidence has corroborated the claim. The pact that began on a wedding night as a theatrical promise of loyalty became the organizing principle of two murders, and the woman who helped kill the man she loved ended the marriage she had sworn to defend with a lethal dose of pills on a Sunday afternoon in Indiana.